We have 4, so we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Redevelopment Agency meeting of Salt Lake City for May 7th, 2018, May 8th, 2018, excuse me. We're going to start this meeting with general comments to the Board of Directors. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to speak to the board tonight or today? Nobody? Okay. If anybody who's tuning in online or Channel 17, you can always submit your comments to the board to our offices at 451 South State Street or to the board electronically via email. We're going to move right along to item B, which is the public hearing for the RDA budget amendment for, RDA budget amendment number 4 for fiscal year 2017-2018. Who do we have at the desk today? Oh, excuse me, this is a public hearing. And I imagine we don't have anybody here for that either. Easy enough. Okay, on to item C, the redevelopment agency business. We're going to start off with item C1, which is the approval of minutes. Board members, any questions, comments, concerns?
They look good. I'll move approval. Second.
It's been moved by Board Member Mendenhall and second by Board Member Fowler. All in favor?
Aye.
And that carries. We are on to item C2, notice of funding availability. And for those who are tuning in, this is an opportunity that the RDA created about a year and a half ago with the carve out of $21 million for affordable housing. This is one of the components of that funding. We've got Danny Waltz, the director of the RDA, and Tammy Hunsaker at the desk. So I'll let you two go ahead and kick it off for us.
Great, thank you. So I believe it was last December, the RDA board decided out of that set aside of $21 million to carve out $10 million for the RDA to administer a notice of funding availability for affordable housing. And of that $10 million, 4.5 of that is earmarked for housing in high opportunity areas. So today's packet includes a policy resolution that, once adopted, will establish guiding policies for the NOFA. And once adopted, the RDA will utilize these policies to finalize and administer the NOFA process. So the draft policy sets forth the NOFA's purpose, eligibility and requirements, standard terms and conditions, and application review and approval process. So if I may, I'll just go over some highlights of the policy. I won't go through all of the details, but just a few highlights. So the purpose of the NOFA is to provide low-cost financial assistance to incentivize the development and preservation of affordable housing within Salt Lake City municipal boundaries. Funding shall be distributed according to a competitive and transparent application process. So essentially, as part of this NOFA, we're requesting applications from any developer who really can demonstrate their ability to construct or rehabilitate affordable housing, who shows a track record of maintaining affordable housing developments, and those projects that align with current policy objectives. So the NOFA policy, the Notice of Funding Availability policy, sets forth what eligible costs can be covered, which are property acquisition, hard construction costs, site improvements, and related soft costs. We're looking at a minimum affordability within a project, so 20% of the units would be the minimum affordability requirement as the policy is currently written. And we're defining affordability at 60% of the area median income and below. We're requesting that applications and projects put forward align with current project priorities that the board discussed, I believe, as the City Council as policy objectives when they adopted the housing plan late last year. And we're also looking for a maximum amount of funds that the RDA contribute be 20% of the total development cost or below, and that's really to help leverage private development. So the standard terms and conditions, we want to be really flexible to allow for different types of projects with various lending requirements be eligible for the funding. So the terms and conditions we're putting forward are pretty flexible. Generally, we want funding to be provided in the form of low interest loans. Repayment, it could be deferred or cash flow payment loans depending on the project's ability for repayment. And we're looking at stipulating a minimum affordability period of 30 years or less. It could be higher, but we kind of wanted to set that threshold at 30 years. The policy also sets forth a 5-step approval process, which begins with an application process. Then RDA staff will do an eligibility review to make sure that all the threshold requirements are being met. Then RDA staff will go through and evaluate projects and rank them against one another, and also rank them against the policy priorities that have been established by the board. There would be a project selection process that would include a review and a recommendation by the RDA Finance Committee. So the RDA Finance Committee is made up of 5 city staff members, so the director of the RDA, of Economic Development, of Community and Neighborhoods, of Finance. I think I'm missing one. 2 members of RAC. That's Community and Neighborhoods. It'll come to me. It'll come to me. I'll come back to that. So a recommendation by the RDA Finance Committee body, and then a project selection. We would actually bring those recommendations forward to the RDA board. So the RDA board would actually get to make the final funding decisions. Once the RDA board makes a decision, we would enter into a conditional commitment period with those applications selected for funding. We had proposed a 12-month conditional commitment period, which would give time for the applicant to get all legal and regulatory and financial commitments in place for loan closing. However, the RDA the Redevelopment Advisory Committee wanted one change to that conditional commitment period, which I'll talk about in a minute. So it's also important to note that the RDA board felt strongly that projects funded through the NOFA should align with current affordable housing priorities. However, we felt like within the NOFA policy, we wanted flexibility to adjust policies as they change over time. So we have prepared and placed project priorities in the memo, but they're not in the actual policy. And these priorities were adapted from those policy statements and guideposts the Salt Lake City Council discussed last fall. So briefly, those priorities that we've pulled out are transit proximity, equity and geographic distribution of affordable housing, mixed income, not only projects but neighborhoods, so incentivizing a higher proportion of affordable units in high opportunity areas and a lower proportion in areas where there's already a concentration of affordable housing, displacement prevention, diversity and innovation of housing types. Specifically, I believe the Salt Lake City Council mentioned adaptive reuse of existing structures as housing, missing middle, and family housing in the urban core. We're also looking at promoting neighborhood revitalization, so prioritizing projects that are located in RDA project areas, prioritizing underserved population and long-term affordability, sustainability, leveraging of private investment, and financial viability.
Tammy, can we jump in really quick?
Sure.
Board Member Mendenhall.
Amy, I appreciate the approach to try to allow this NOFA to be flexible with the potential for future housing priority changes, but a lot of these are they're issues that I want in policy. They're issues that I think they're policy issues, they're not memo. They become administrative discretion to me when they're in a memo, and they become letter of the law when they're in the policy. So when we get into it, the discussion, I'll be asking my peers to look at giving feedback on including them in the policy itself. But do you want to respond to that?
And that definitely can be done. I think as Danny and I talked through this, one of the thoughts was that maybe there would be another pot of RDA funds set aside in a future fiscal year to carry out the same sort of competitive process. So we kind of thought maybe we should make this policy flexible enough to carry it over to different fiscal years as project priorities change. But I can definitely see the benefits of including the project priorities in the policy. So.
Yeah, I mean, we looked at it from 2 different standpoints. Number one, we felt that the city policies for housing are basically that governing document that we would refer to within the NOFA policy. So that document, as it's changed and updated and reflects the city's current goals, if this policy just reflected to that, then we knew we were always reflecting and pointing people to what the current city goals and policies are for housing. And then number two, as Tammy said, by setting the NOFA up as a ongoing policy and not just a one-time distribution of these funds, it allows it to be something that you can continue to reuse. And we wanted to have that flexibility, so if you did use it again, you could say, okay, in the future, this $5 million, we wanted to focus on TOD housing. And then you could put a NOFA out for that, and so that flexibility would be built in. That's not to say there's one right or wrong way to do it. That was just our motivation, is to point to the set policies and then have the flexibility within issuing of this. But we can certainly have that conversation if you want to go in a different direction.
Board Member Ballard?
I mean, I agree with Board Member Mendenhall in that it always worries me to have, and you know this because we've had these discussions, to have discretion outside when there's not as cool of counsel as we are, or there's some other thing happening. And I look at this NOFA would be particular to housing, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me that all of these priorities, whether it be now or honestly 10 years from now, all would probably still be the same priorities as we're looking at affordable housing, right? I mean, I just don't really see those changing that much as we're looking at what we care about as far as affordable housing goes. Mixed income, diversity, equity, I mean, we want those to continue throughout forever as we're creating affordable housing. So to me, at this point, I don't see a downside or a con for putting it in policy, but there might be one that I'm missing. So if there is, let me, besides just that flexibility, but again, I think somebody can always come and change the policy, right? And so there is still room for flexibility in the sense that that can always be changed.
Right, and that was our focus, is not to have the policies change within the NOFA, but to have the policies change within the city's policy and just refer to that as the guiding document.
Board Member Mendenhall?
Are you ready for me to dig in, or do you have more of your presentation?
Well, just a quick update. I had forgot one member of the Finance Committee, its hand. So the Finance Committee, that's the recommending body, is the Director of Finance, RDA, Economic Development, Community, Neighborhoods, and HAND, and then 2 members with financial expertise on our Redevelopment Advisory Committee. And just one other point that I wanted to make is that we presented this policy to the Redevelopment Advisory Committee on May 2nd, just last week, and they recommended approval of the policy as presented with one modification, and that was to the section on the conditional commitment period. We had proposed 12 months unless otherwise approved by the board, and they felt like 12 months could be a short time frame for complicated projects or larger projects. So they wanted additional flexibility and the policy to actually provide for RDA staff and the RDA board to set different conditional commitment periods based on the project type. So for a rehab project, it might only be 6 months, but for a complex project, it might be 18. So that they have their specific language provided to you on their recommendation. So.
Great.
Board Member Mendenhall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm talking to you, my peers on the council, and I'm hoping to walk us through the housing priorities. And as council member or board member Fowler talked about, I would like us to straw poll or do whatever mechanism you, Mr. Chair, feel like is necessary to put these into the policy. So I'm looking at housing priorities, which is section 2 on our page 2 of 10. And I want to, on the very first one, the transit proximity, I'd like to add in here to include the frequent transit network lines that we're looking to add with our sales tax increase and the upcoming improvements to our transit system here in Salt Lake City. So, Mr. Chair, would you like me to set up straw polls?
I think we should straw poll because we can just adjust this as we go along.
Okay, so then my straw poll would be that we include in the policy, the priority of transit proximity, and that it state to encourage access to public transit, priority will be given to projects that are located within a half-mile walking distance of a track station, S-line station, other fixed-line transit, or frequent transit network lines. Stop, I'm open to, as defined in the master transit plan, transit master plan.
All right, so board members,
That makes sense?
yeah. So just looking at the language here under item 2, or section 2, item 1, transit proximity, all that language plus something
Frequent transit
that adds
network
the,
lines.
you know, the frequent transit network as laid out in the transit master plan. All in favor? All right, 6 in favor, Charlie abstaining. Go ahead, Aaron.
Number 2, equity and
Or
geographic
Absent,
distribution.
excuse me.
The word high opportunity areas, correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory is that in hand language, high opportunity areas are those which are, we're currently allocating CDBG dollars to and focusing. Am I wrong? So those are still low opportunity areas. But do you remember all this this conversation that we had in about a year ago around calling them areas of high opportunity because there's a lot of opportunity for us to improve? Does anyone else?
I thought that we had defined it to be around the opportunity index as done by the county or the University of Utah.
And that's what
So-
I was basing it on.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure that high
I
opportunity
see where
area
you're going
means
with
the
that, and I
same
could
thing
see
in the
how it could be
RDA.
construed, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember us having a discussion about that. What does high opportunity mean?
Right, and the foundation of that was from the Fair Housing Equity Assessment that Jim Wood did, and then he recently updated the data for the mayor's office, which is what we'd be using in this current NOFA. So
Okay.
it's primarily neighborhoods, kind of, it jogs around, but generally east of 7th or 13th.
And this is to address the 4.5 that we originally set
Yes.
aside for east side, but that definition obviously didn't hold any water.
And just a follow-up question, I heard new data and new information that has been updated. Do you know if we've received that yet?
I believe I received it from Hand, and I thought they had transmitted it to you, but I am not sure.
I don't know.
We'll
can-
look for it.
We can follow up
Okay.
with staff on that.
Then my straw,
Board
please.
Member Fowler.
Real quick, just as a point to that. And I guess, Board Member Mendenhall, I could have let you do your straw poll first, because my only suggestion would be that on some of these, and this is the lawyer brain in me, on some of these sort of unique terms, if we could include, and they may already be included, but a definition so that people understand who don't have these unique terms, what we are defining as a high opportunity area, what that actually means, so that they can adapt their applications or whatever they're doing to make sure that they're fitting our parameters. And that just reminded me, so I wanted to get that out there, that we're defining those terms for people, so.
Yeah, we have a definition, it's ranked on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high opportunity, and I think Hand was looking at 6 and above, now as defined as the high opportunity areas. So we have that, and we have a map as well, so.
Great.
Okay,
Board
so
Member-
my straw poll would just be that we include the equity and geographic distribution point in the policy. If you're
Okay.
catching on that, I'm going to straw poll it, we put all of these in the policy
All right.
with no changes.
Can you restate that for us?
I asked that the language around equity and geographic distribution be included in the policy, which is to encourage geographic distribution of affordable housing throughout Salt Lake City. Priority will be given to projects located within high opportunity areas, and a minimum of 4.5 million in funding shall be earmarked for qualifying projects,
Along with the definition.
or reference to the
Reference.
definition, yeah.
Okay. All right, all in favor?
Asterisks will suffice.
Could I speak to that real quick? Just a clarification. When you include that in the policy, I would assume you're okay if we take out that $4.5 million because that's
Yes,
specific to
good
this
point.
offering and not all future offerings?
Yes, thank you.
I assumed that, but I wanted to.
Good
Clarify.
catch.
Okay. Shall we straw poll that?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Wait, can you restate it?
I like
I'm-
another.
So these housing priorities aren't included in the policy, and I want these priorities to be carried through into the policy so that they can't, my fear in the few years that I've sat on this board is that sometimes we get a project before us and they say, well, you know, these are recommendations or these are guiding principles, but they don't bind the funding. I'm not talking about the SNOFA, this is a brand new thing, or about you personally, but that we don't bind the funding necessarily to our priorities unless it's in the policy. And I'm looking to bind our values here to the policy and the money. This is part of the 21 million that we set aside really intentionally for affordable housing. And I want to be clear, I want us to be clear through the policy what we want this money to be used for.
Board Member Johnston, please.
Can you help me remember how these relate to our general housing policy outside of the RDA for the city? Anybody? Anyone?
These were based out of your guideposts that were approved as part of, not as part of, but in conjunction with, I believe, your city housing plan. So they're not necessarily within the housing plan as much as they were approved by the council to be those guideposts.
Yeah,
Jennifer
they actually,
Bruno.
they're a section within the housing plan, and
Okay.
they were added, so it was a, it was a
I don't
change.
think I was here for that.
The council added them as a section in the housing plan. I think, and Cindy can speak to this, but I think it's a way of kind of capturing in very brief summary form all of the policy that's throughout the rest of the housing plan. Is that kind of a fair?
And I should note that I did reword them. Some of them didn't apply to a notice of funding availability. I consolidated a few of them, but I think the intent of all of them are in here.
So I guess my question comes from, if we have a housing policy for the city, this is a separate housing policy that should be aligned for RDA, right, with the overall city. Why wouldn't we just say that the RDA's got to be bound by the city housing policy? That way, if we ever update the city housing policy, it applies to both without having to say, at some point, we change one or not the other, and then they're not in alignment.
That sounds simple. Yes, please, Cindy.
The housing policy and really all master plan type policies are so broad that really you can interpret them in hundreds of different ways. So the guideposts were the key things that the council kept going back to, and that's why we listed them so specifically. So it sounds like the RDA staff has picked those things up, modified them slightly so that they fit into this format. But you could get something that the administration says, hey, this is consistent with the housing plan. And it might be consistent with a minor point in the housing plan, but it might not address your diverse types of housing or the near transit or those key things that were important to you. So if those key things are the most important things to you still, then you'd want to include them.
So the RDA monies under this scenario, if we put it into policy, would be really bound to these. They'd have to meet these, versus our overall housing policy would not have to.
There's just so much, the policies, it just includes
Sure.
so much that as long as it's housing, really it's a good thing. And what you're doing with this RDA money is narrowing it to those things that you spent several months on settling that those were your top interests.
Okay.
You okay proceeding in this way?
Yeah, I want to make sure that we're in the Aaron's point. I mean, Board Member Mendenhall's point is well taken. That make these last the policy makes sense. I also know how confusing it gets when we have multiple policies that we're not quite sure match up. We think they should now because we've done a lot of work and you've made sure they fit. But if we changed either one of those without changing the other one, we run into this issue again. So how do we make sure we're consistent across them?
Board Member Fowler.
Well, I also look at it in this way, in that this is a request for a project. And if we have policy within here that we all agree on right now, then it creates a clearer picture for what we're looking for and how we're going to spend that. And so I think even if your housing policy changes, if this is sort of, or is altered a little bit, I think if this is specific to our goals as to what we want housing through this RDA funding to look like, you don't have to change one and then automatically change the other if this is all written in a policy, because this is what we want out of this money. Does that make, and that way it's clear too to developers that if you're not willing to do this, then even if it aligns with, you know, our other priorities, if it's written in policy, I feel like it's much clearer for applicants to be able to say, well, this is a project that I really want to undertake. It seems like this can be a little bit separate than a very broad housing policy.
I agree with you, and I think that when we're talking about tax increment dollars, there on this list, for instance, I see some additional goals that we want to achieve with these resources that we may not if we were just using general fund dollars and following the housing policy. So neighborhood revitalization, for instance, I don't recall if that's in the housing policy, at least in this way. So just adding on to that. Aaron, did you want to reframe or rephrase what you?
The straw polls, just to include, I'm gonna ask to straw poll every one of these
Do it all
10
once.
items. We could do it all at once, but I have a couple changes. So maybe I should just rattle through the changes and then we could just straw poll the inclusion.
I mean,
of-
we're on number 2, so why don't you give us your changes and we'll do each one.
Thanks. I don't have changes in every one. My changes to number 3 are that I'm uncomfortable with any allowance for non-mixed income projects with this money. And I feel that the way this is worded with to encourage mixed income developments and prioritizing those that are mixed income leaves the door open for the possibility that some wouldn't be. And I'm not comfortable with projects. So I'd like us to clarify the language that
To fund mixed income developments and neighborhoods, priority will be given to projects that diversify the economic mix of the neighborhood.
yeah, and I guess is that clear enough? Cindy, do you have?
One thought you could is just leave that priority will be given to and just leave the first sentence there so that it just says mixed income. That's what you're offering funding for.
Uh-huh.
So,
So priority would be given to projects that are mixed income. Let it go on from there.
okay, all in favor?
Awesome.
That carries unanimously. All right, what else, Aaron?
Number 4, I just want to add the word existing households. I know it's probably silly, but displacement prevention. At the very end there, it says to avert low-income households from being impacted by development activities, priority will be given to projects that limit, prevent, or successfully mitigate the displacement of existing households. I'm not sure why, when I read this, I felt like that was necessary. Maybe it's not necessary.
Well, I was just going to state that there are a lot of projects in the city where I wouldn't feel comfortable, defining it like that. We have some motels that they're going to be displaced, and we don't want that type of environment there.
Right, I think I meant the people. So when we talk about households, are we talking about the people? Like, when Han talks about households, sometimes it feels interchangeable.
Well, I know, but it just says priority will be given to projects that limit, prevent, or successfully mitigate.
And when I wrote that, in my mind, successfully mitigate, looking at the overnighter, we as the RDA are relocating all the residents according to the Uniform Relocation Act. So that's successfully, I think if.
Maybe you're talking about individuals, and James is talking about brick and
Projects.
mortar. So I think maybe it would just help. The word existing isn't the answer, but
I would just rather say, have it say something about displacement prevention of the projects. You know, it just states that we'll do everything that we possibly can, you know, to include people if there is a displacement. But to say that we're going to highlight projects that limit, prevent, or successfully,
yeah, that's not what I meant.
yeah.
I meant the people
I mean, I
part
don't
of
want to
it.
see the Capitol Motel be the Capitol Motel again and again and again.
So could we change the households to more clearly reflect that we mean individuals, or?
Buildings. I think it's buildings. Is that your?
No, I think we mean people.
Yeah.
I think
I'm
it's
asking
gotta
sort of
be-
the written was the people or the building?
People, and I think my intention for the wording of this was, if a developer proposes a project where people are currently living there, I think in their application, they need to explain how they are going to successfully relocate and
People.
Yes.
people.
Okay.
Yes.
Board members, I know Cindy Gus Jensen would like to add.
Just to refresh back to that conversation, one of the things that was concerning is taking a unit that's in fairly decent shape, or a set of units, has low-income people, taking those folks out and then modifying the units and putting lower-income people in. So the idea of displacing one set of low-income people for another set of low-income people didn't make a lot of policy sense when what we need is more units.
That
Know how to,
That was when we were saying maybe it's housing 20% AMI folks, and this is going to create 60% AMI units. And do we want to put our money towards shuffling people?
right. Yeah, so that was what the conversation was about, and I see now that it's confusing.
Yeah, I don't think this point prevents that,
Well,
unless we clarify individuals.
I think it's always clear cut though, because there may be times when private money wants to come in and renovate a dilapidated place, and they may have a different population they're trying to serve. They're not necessarily more or less needing of housing, but it's a different population. And making sure we're clear that, are we going to be very specific and say no, or are we going to leave some latitude to say if it hits the intention?
Board member Fowler.
I think that this is a good policy to have in there, but I think that there is a lot of confusion, clearly, around it. And I think to Board Member Johnston's point, and something that you said, Tammy, was that the intent behind this was, if you're going to propose a project, you also need to propose a solution. If your project is going to create some issue that we're concerned about, then you need to be able to propose a solution.
Right.
And I'm wondering if there is, either we sort of reword this a little bit or rework it, where we're kind of, because it does seem like there's a lot of confusion there, and maybe we could come back to that with a different proposal of wording there.
Sure.
And then just before we continue with what we were doing, I also had a suggestion as I was listening to this, if we are going to put this into policy, if we could come back and say, and start everything with more of the priority will be given, and not the because first, but just a priority first. Again, I think that creates some clarity as people are reading through the policy. They're very clear of what that policy is, that we will be giving priority to these things. We can have a section about why we're doing that after, but that was just again, lawyer brain.
So did you have a straw poll on this one, Aaron?
No, it's
Okay.
just part of the overall inclusion in the policy.
Okay.
And I have just,
If I may add to this really quick, I would like for some reference to language around adding a net increase in affordable housing, more than just mitigating and displacement prevention. I think adding to the housing stock in numbers is important here as well. So
support that.
as long as, is it okay if we just straw poll that rough language and let staff include it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do this one more time, because I kind of still want to, if we're going to do that, still tie it to projects will be given priority on the affordability and higher areas of opportunity or something to that effect. So we're not mitigating it in the same place over and over, increasing it. We're actually looking for better places of this affordability to go.
That's a good question about priorities, because on one point, we say we're going to give priority for RDA areas, and then another point, we say we're going to give high opportunity area priorities, and those are possibly very different areas of the city.
Right.
So are these weighted priorities? I don't think so, based on what you've presented, but.
Well, we were in the actual administrative NOFA document anticipating potentially giving weight and ranking criteria to each of these. So these would be the priorities that developers would look at as they're proposing projects. So, so for example, if you add one on a net increase of affordable housing, is that an overarching policy of this pot of money, or is that project specific? Because that could rule out substantial rehab of units, which is currently an eligible use under the NOFA. Like, if there's a really dilapidated apartment building, potentially a developer could come in and rehab that, put the 30-year deed restriction in, and there wouldn't be a net increase of units for that specific project.
So, Board Member Johnston, can I ask why you voted opposition to that?
Exactly what she just
I see.
said. I think we bind ourselves into you have to increase the net, and when sometimes we're trying to protect historic sort of places or things that add to the community that wouldn't necessarily have more affordable afterwards, but have much better experience for the affordable people living there. I hate binding us that much. We're trying to bind ourselves enough to make sure it still happens, but not so much that we're going to restrict a lot of things that may not fit exactly.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
These feel like one of those balancing tests where, like Cindy was saying, reflecting our previous conversation, where we don't want to displace one set of affordable just to move in another set of affordable, not increase the net number of housing units, and recognizing on the other side that we might actually want to do that sometimes, or there may be some historic building context that makes us want to. And I'm not sure there's a perfect language scenario, except that there's a whole list of priorities that you can take some and leave some in different projects.
Yeah,
I mean, it is outlined in the housing guideposts that we'd want to add to our housing stock overall, right? So, I mean, if we're going to be prioritizing mixed income and mixed use, then I don't see why we couldn't also prioritize an increase in overall units, be they affordable or not.
Well, I think an example is we're doing a project that's an existing affordable housing. It needs some rehab, and we're going to put money into it and replace the people who are living there. Now, there's federal restrictions. You have to make sure they have a place to go, and you have a certain amount of time. You have to help them out, and there's laws about that. I think it's written in here about displacement means you have to put them in another place. But the people moving in are seriously and persistently mentally ill, and it serves a big need, but it doesn't necessarily keep the same folks who were there before, and it doesn't increase the number. And that's where I'm concerned about restricting those, and they may be far fewer number of these, but that's where I'm concerned about restricting it to some extent.
All right. Well, in that case, let's just move along then.
We're going to whistle past the graveyard.
Well, I think this hits
And we can definitely do it either way.
But this is the point, that there's a balancing act between allowing them flexibility to adapt to all these interesting scenarios and still helping us to feel comfortable with the amount of oversight, right? So that's where I tend to rely on sort of them a little more, and maybe other folks wouldn't, and I don't know how to find that balance exactly.
But we could certainly prioritize projects that are adding to the stock of affordable housing over other ones when they're presented to you. I mean, you ultimately make the final funding decision.
Yeah. You have a question, Board Member Fowler?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. So, I mean, right now, what we're doing essentially is creating a policy surrounding our priorities, right? And what I think we could do, as we saw with the displacement prevention, as we're seeing with the net increase, is create another sort of, with each of these very specific policies that we're all on board with. There could be another piece of that policy that says, you know, sort of the additional factors would include that we would look at. So part of that policy would say something very lawyerly vague about the fact that, but that we would also look at other factors or other priorities that the council or the administration or the housing policy include as we're looking at recommending these applications, right? There could be kind of a catch-all policy phrase at the bottom of that saying that, you know, if it's in line with all of these other priorities and you have a tie and one is increasing the net stock of our housing, then that might get priority over the other one, right? Because it has more. Does that make sense? I mean, there, you can kind of have a catch-all at the bottom of this saying, we will also be looking at all of the other priorities of the housing, of our housing policies or whatever, right? But these are the ones that are really important to us. And then there's this other thing. Even though they're all really important to us, these ones, does that make sense? Just kind of trying to also build in some of that flexibility.
Would you like to propose a straw poll or do, okay. Okay, Board Member Wharton, please.
So if I think I understand what you're saying, you want like a, this is on a list of priorities, but non-exhaustive. There may be other yet identified priorities.
Something along those lines.
Okay. You want like a 10th Amendment?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Board Member Mendenhall, you have something to offer?
I think that is what the board is. That's what we do when they bring us the project proposals, the funding opportunities, that we look at all of the documents that we have in our policy and overlay that will happen, even if there isn't language. I think just that's the process of the board. I had one more change to these 10, which was on point 7. The last 3 words are long-term affordability, and I wondered how we define long-term affordability for this money.
Well, we have the threshold requirement of 30 years, so it was anticipated these would be used to rank projects against one another, so that would be one of the ranking criteria, the
Okay.
affordability period, with a minimum of 30 years.
So, Mr. Chair, should I make that straw poll now
Yes,
to
please offer.
move all of those into policy?
Yes. Actually, can I add something myself really quickly, at least toss something out for dialogue? I would like to reference, and I don't know that we want to prioritize every project like this, but I think it's important that we start talking about owner-occupied affordability. And I don't know if where this would fit in this, you know, these 10 points, but it would be nice if we could at least reference that it's important to us to have owner-occupied affordable housing constructed in our city. Do you have any thoughts on that, Cindy?
You would, no.
No.
A little one, you're not talking about single-family owner-occupied.
Not
It could be
necessarily.
multifamily.
And I was thinking about it here in maybe innovative housing types, but I don't know if it actually fits anywhere here, so. No.
Maybe we can talk to Han and RDA staff and come back with a
Yeah, that sounds
couple
good.
of thoughts.
All right, go ahead, Board Member Mendenhall.
Well, I think your question with our upcoming agenda item on RDA housing funding overview, that we could
Yeah,
put it in there. I think it's a great one.
great.
I think it's hard to imagine owner-occupied, but I have no idea, coming to ask for loans from this 10 million, but maybe it is. Okay, so my motion is that the housing priorities 1 through 10 be adapted, as we've discussed, to be included in the policy.
All right, board members, all in favor? That carries.
Mr. Chair,
6 in favor, yes.
promise, I just have one more item.
Do you want to take over?
I know, I'm sorry. I really like RDA stuff
teasing.
lately.
Yes, please.
So this is in the policy under 2.5, which is the minimum affordability. It's page 5 of 10 for us. The last sentence there reads that the RDA funding shall be sized in proportion to the affordable component, but that language to me doesn't say that it would be sized in proportion to the AMI depth. It sounds like it's number of units. Is that correct?
Yes, but that could mean, I guess it could be interpreted either way, and we could add some clarifying language.
I would like, maybe we need to ask the board, but I would like that proportional sizing to also reflect AMI depth, not just number of units. I would, I know that there's we don't reference AMI in the
We do.
priorities. We do?
Yeah, it's under number 7.
Thank you. So I think it should be part of the weighting on that affordability.
Sure.
Could you
yeah.
come up with some language? Not right now.
Board Member Johnston?
Are you saying they'd both have to be in there, or either or?
No, that when they are, as it says, the RDA funding shall be sized in proportion to the affordable component.
Mhm.
I'd like that affordable component to include both the unit number ratio and the AMI depth, that there be some formula so that it may have a higher priority if it's funding a lower AMI,
So fewer units.
perhaps.
Okay, that's my question, was it wouldn't have to be both. But it could be either or as long as we interpret it as either or.
That we might be measuring for both.
Well, I guess what I meant was, right now it reads to me it could be either or. Affordable component could mean depth of AMI or number of units.
Mhm.
And if we interpreted that as either or, then you could say, well, this project has more units, but they're not all deeply affordable. This project has fewer units, but they're very deeply affordable. Which one would get weight?
You also have to keep in mind that when we're talking areas of opportunity, it's going to cost more to develop over there as well. And so, we just have to be mindful of how the economics of a project are going to shake out. Board Member Fowler, do you have something to offer as well?
I think this might somewhat go, not to the language, but to this discussion and some of the other things, is in point number 6, the monitoring and compliance. Now that we're sort of asking to put those priorities into policy, I'm wondering if it would be helpful to sort of, where we say that projects are complying with affordability and other requirements, if that we sort of define what that looks like as far as that monitoring goes, meaning some sort of language that says that we're going to monitor the projects as to how they're living up to these policies that we've created, right? These 10 priorities / policies that we've just created, and kind of making those maybe the parameters that we're monitoring, so that we can make sure that we're funding, and I think that was just some security for us as board members of like, oh yeah, we did fund that project and it's actually reaching all of these priorities and parameters that we listed prior to that. Or maybe just expanding that language a little bit, however seems realistic, but
Sure.
does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Board members, anything else? Staff?
There is one more thing.
Okay,
sorry.
please.
Did we need some discussion on the 12-month versus the 36-month? Is that what, and that language regarding the conditional?
Yeah, the way the policy is written right now is it has the 12 months. RAC's recommendation is that you increase that. I think Tammy's provided that language.
Yeah, they actually changed the sentence, so it reads, "The NOFA shall set forth the process for establishing the term of the conditional commitment and extension of the term." So they removed that specific timeline from the policy and said that it would just be established through, essentially it allows it to be established on a case-by-case basis, depending on project needs.
And that would be part of the approval, the contingency of the approval for funding.
Okay. Do we have any concerns, board members, on timelines or?
I just have a quick clarifying question. So do you mean that before we give the funding, we would have determined what the conditional timeline would be? before we approve the
Mhm.
project. So you'd say,
Right.
and this would be conditional for 6 months because it's going to only be this much. Or you'd come to us and say, yeah, this is a really big project, they're going to need 3 years.
Yeah, you would approve that as part of the funding allocation,
Okay.
as well as potentially milestones that they would have to hit. If it's a longer term, you could build in milestones. That funding is contingent on hitting those individual milestones.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Staff?
Mr. Chair, I'm wondering if with so many changes, if we should go back and revise the policy and present it next month with the updates?
I
Or,
think that would be helpful for us, as long as it's, that, I mean, yes, since you proposed that, then I would say yes.
and this gives us good
Okay.
direction, so we can continue working on the actual NOFA document, so
Yeah.
we won't lose any time, I don't believe, in getting that out. And just going back to one of the policy priorities that you actually proposed, the net increase in affordable housing, we could actually try to work that in as well, because I don't think that that would necessarily exclude rehab projects, but we would just use that in our ranking criteria that you would see project by project.
It's an important consideration,
It
and I
is.
think it'd be nice to see it in there somewhere. Yeah, so that would be great.
And it was in one of your guideposts that was approved, so I'll work that in as well.
Great. Anything else before we move on? Okay. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's see. Now we are on to item C3, housing funding overview. We have you two at the table once again. Welcome back.
Just keep the conversation going.
Okay, so this is for an overview of housing requirements, historical and ongoing practices, and policy considerations for an RDA housing funding policy. Tammy, do you want to kickstart this?
Sure, yes. I believe last December when you appropriated money for or set aside money for the NOFA, you also directed RDA staff to come back with an affordable housing funding policy, looking at specific issues like how we as RDA staff work through our budget, the set aside of money for the Housing Trust Fund, and for affordable housing in general. So if I may, I'll just hit a few highlights of what Utah Code 17C currently requires and what the RDA has been working on as far as recent practices. And then that we have a few policy questions at the end if the board wishes to provide direction. So to give an overview, the required housing allocation that's set aside by Utah state law, or that we need to set aside by Utah state law, is actually determined by the year under which the project area was adopted. So it's not the current code, it's the code under which the project area was adopted. So currently we have a 20% requirement from Depot, Granary, North Temple, a 10% requirement for Northwest Quadrant, and we do not have a requirement with the Central Business District or West Temple Gateway, because those project areas were established before there was a housing allocation requirement. And then we do have a few project areas with a restricted budget, like the ballpark, Block 70, and the North Temple Viaduct. So as per the budget, we can't really allocate any funds from those project areas to housing. So to give you an idea, we were looking at numbers before the meeting. The current set aside for Depot, Granary, and North Temple, you're looking at just under $900,000 in a budget year for those required set asides. And then traditionally, the RDA has set aside 10% from those project areas where we can set aside housing funds, but there's no requirement. And to give you an idea, that's about with the non-obligated funds from the Central Business District, that's about $1 million a year. So the Central Business District 10% is actually higher than the required 20% from Depot, Granary, and North Temple combined. So the required housing allocation. So as per Utah statute, we're required to set aside the 20% from Depot, North Temple, and Granary, and now Northwest Quadrant, and you have to use that housing fund very specifically to pay part of the cost of land for rehab construction of housing. You can lend, grant, or contribute money to a person, public entity, housing authority, business, nonprofit for housing. You can use it for planning for housing or make payments on a bond for housing. You can also use it within project areas. This is kind of an interesting piece of the code. You can actually use the affordable housing set-aside allocation for any AMI housing within project areas where blight's found to exist. The RDA hasn't traditionally done this, but you can use your affordable housing set-aside for market rate, say in North Temple, because blight's been found to exist there. Replace housing units lost as a result of project area development, or relocate mobile home park residents. As an alternative, you can take all of your required housing set aside and allocate the funds to the community, the Housing Authority of Salt Lake City, the Olene Walker Housing Loan Fund, or to the County Housing Authority for use for affordable housing. So this is what's required by law.
How do
Tammy?
they define community? I'm sorry, Mr.
That's
Chair.
exactly what I was going to ask. Thank you.
We might want to ask Katie.
We have
that.
Katie Lewis. Katie, would you like to come to the table? And I wonder as well if we'd be able to direct this toward the Community Land Trust as well.
And I think that's where the Housing Trust Fund qualifies, and the Community Land Trust.
Hi, I'm sorry, repeat your question?
So over here on the asterisk at the bottom where it says note, we were wondering what community is it? The RDA may allocate funds to the community.
Yep.
What does that mean?
So I was just looking at 17C when you asked me to come up. I'm 98% sure that community is the definition of the municipality. So it's anywhere within the municipal boundaries that the RDA exists.
So is this language pulled from 17C or? Okay.
It is.
Board Member Fowler.
Katie, just to clarify, the municipality, it doesn't have to be within a project area then, it's just actually the boundaries of the city, or whatever.
Correct. So in practice, what the RDA has done is given a portion of its money to the Housing Trust Fund, so which is the community, the city's housing fund, and so that's the way that it has used its required housing allocation to give to the community.
Got it.
So with the required housing allocation, as per 17C, we are also required to maintain a separate housing fund and track these funds separately, including all interest of the funds. And we are now required to report on the utilization of housing funds and how we've used those funds to address moderate income housing needs. The affordability restriction for this pot of money is 80% AMI and below. It can be used citywide. And as I stated before, there's kind of a caveat if you're using the funds within a project area where blight's been found to exist. And blight's been found to exist in all of our project areas, except for the special, like the Block 70 CDA and the ballpark, not the CDAs, and not the North Temple or the Northwest Quadrant project area. Blight has not been found to exist there. So on top of the required housing fund, we can allocate additional housing funds, and we're kind of looking at these funds as more discretionary because there are additional eligible activities for these funds. So you can provide housing activities in project areas, even project areas where blight has not been found to exist. You can do market rate housing. You can increase, improve, or preserve affordable housing supply anywhere within municipal boundaries. And affordable housing, as per 17C, is defined as what the municipality defines affordable housing as per resolution. So you could define affordable housing as a higher or a lower AMI and use these funds citywide for that AMI. So we can do a discretionary housing fund. So historical and ongoing practices, as I mentioned at the top, we have not only been allocating the required housing funds, but we've been doing 10% from the project areas where we don't have, there's no requirement. So that's been West Temple Gateway and the Central Business District. And as Katie stated, we've kind of been dividing these between citywide and project area housing. And we've been allocating a portion of the set aside we've been putting towards citywide housing to the Housing Trust Fund. And that amount has varied year by year just depending on budget needs. Just looking at program and tools, RDA can use housing funds pretty much citywide, except for the tax increment reimbursement program that we do support affordable housing through. That can only be used currently within designated RDA project areas, just because that's where we're collecting the tax increment that would then be reimbursed to the project. But I know, Mr. Chair, I believe you asked RDA staff to look into a citywide policy to do that, which we are working on.
Great.
So essentially, as RDA staff works to develop this draft policy for your review, there are a lot of nuances to affordable housing funds, and we have some policy questions you may want to consider. In addition to the required housing allocation, does the board wish to continue the historical practice of allocating that 10% set aside from those project areas where we're not required to? So since West Temple Gateway is expiring, this would pretty much be the central business district, which that does add up quickly. Of the amount designated for housing, does the board wish to continue the historical practice of designating a portion of these to citywide activities and a portion to project area? And then a new policy question that recently came up is, what guidelines should we use when designating funding to the Housing Trust Fund? How may the designation of other funding sources to the Housing Trust Fund impact the funding level from the RDA? This is a question with the recent sales tax allocation. So if you have input on these questions or any other comments or questions, we'd enjoy the feedback.
And that's an important question because historically it has been the RDA that's primarily funded the Housing Trust Fund, correct?
Correct.
So board members, do you have any questions or follow-ups to any of this? Board Member Johnston, anything? Wharton? Mendenhall?
Yeah.
Please.
That sounds like a softball of, do we still have to contribute to the Housing Trust Fund now that you've passed a sales tax to put money in there
That
from
was not
another
intended
source?
like that. no.
Definitely not.
Kind of sounds like that. And the answer is yes. If you ask me, you still have to contribute to the Housing Trust Fund. But that's just Aaron. So I wondered on the, and I'm not looking at the slideshow, but at the staff report in here. I'm wondering how this policy works with that of hand and about in the growing SLC plan, and actually there's a part in here under the policy questions and considerations under item 4.3 where it says your question about what guidelines should RDA use. I think that if we do set guidelines, that I want them to go beyond today's board and today's RDA staff and today's hand staff, and be able to understand the department's respective roles and overlap where necessary, but not replicate work, right? That I don't want to create products, financial products within the RDA that are already happening and functioning well within hand, or vice versa. So if we're going to set up thresholds for that allocation or evaluation criteria, then I think a foundational part of that policy would need to be in defining roles and defining intersections. So that is, because I think right now it's more of a relationship and it's not in policy. So I would like us to create a policy. One of the policy questions for me that isn't in the list is having policy language that recognizes the displacement of populations due to redevelopment and aligns this recognition with available housing dollars through the RDA. And we do that, we just did that with NOFA, that for that particular pot of money, but I'd like us to do it in all of our considerations, at least to consider the reality of dislocation of people through redevelopment activities and recognize, I know that not everyone who's living on North Temple or State Street right now is necessarily going to be incorporated into whatever new developments are happening, but I want to shift that with this redevelopment agency in Salt Lake City. I want that to be part of every conversation going forward, that we recognize displacement. And we ask our developer partners to recognize that and potentially propose solutions to it.
Board Member Fowler.
I have a couple of things. One, to piggyback on what Board Member Mendenhall said, I do think that there's a policy discussion, and it doesn't need to happen today, but I think we need to get that for my other board members, policy discussion regarding what the role is for RDA in housing and what that role is for HAND in housing and how we can work together. Those two organizations can work together, but I think there might be slightly different goals and objectives, and I just think that we need to figure out what those goals and objectives are so that so that everybody can have all of their pieces of pie and do the best they can with it. And I just think it's more of what Board Member Mendenhall was saying, kind of defining some of that and understanding what those roles and objectives are. But that's for a lot of discussion, I think. But something that might be an easier question to answer or not, I don't know. Can you guesstimate roughly like a percentage or a range that has been given to the Housing Trust Fund over the past X amount of years? Like generally you'd say some sort of amount or percentage was given.
I don't think it's ever been based on a certain percentage, which is one of the methods we were actually looking at, whether it's a percentage or a flat amount each year, or if we're trying to determine what threshold to propose to you through our budget. Is it based on a minimum and then a percentage over if tax increment increases? We don't know, but I mean, it's varied, the allocation to the Housing Trust Fund, anywhere from a few $100,000 to several $100,000. It's been all over the place.
I think for me, it would be helpful if I could maybe see those numbers and look at that as far as why the trend is what it is, why it was what it was that year, and then it changed, and what we saw as an increase, because that might help that policy discussion. If there is some sort of pattern or some sort of, we can look at, this is basic, this is the foundation, and then we do 10% above that. Or maybe that's not the answer. Maybe it is a flat fee, but maybe having for me personally, having some of those numbers might be helpful in framing a policy that makes sense.
Right.
As we look at your budget and at the budget. So it just might help us get some of that historical information.
Sure.
Thank you, Board Member Feller. We're going to go over here to our lone wolf, James Rogers.
Hello, down there. I would like to actually have policy discussion in regards to possibly bonding with this money, doing a public-private partnership with outside sources that we could see what we could actually do. And that would, of course, go back to the Attorney's Office to discuss that and then have that policy discussion here as a board.
So as far as like figuring out what our capacity is and what options, what
And is that something that
easy
everyone's
options?
interested in doing?
I see. All right, Danny, Tammy, you good to come back to us with that
Yeah,
information?
we can take a look at that. I think that depends on, you would have to really memorialize a commitment for the housing and what you would hope to accomplish with the upfront cash of bonding.
Right.
So I think the difficulty in that would be you don't have a set payment stream as much as what would that range be in terms of bonding and in that capacity.
I think it's
And each project area has a different requirement of
Well,
what
and
that
I'm
housing
even
is.
looking at the possibility with the sales tax too.
It's important to note, though, that it's only through the RDA that we can bond for housing.
Right.
So this is an important conversation for this body, acting as the board of the RDA. Board Member Johnston, please.
Did we talk about these three specifically, and are we going to talk about now, or are we going to wait? Because
Yeah, go ahead.
it seems to me that number two relies on number one. Just because if we don't continue the Central Business District contributing to that, there is no citywide. there's no housing. Period. Either because nothing we generate in any other place generates enough to do anything.
Board Member Mendenhall.
Well, you were just saying a couple $100,000, but CBDs generated $1 million towards citywide housing. And there've been a few years that it's been $2 million that the RDA's been putting towards the Housing Trust Fund, right?
Yeah, it's been a case-by-case basis every year, and it spans across different ways that the RDA has done their budget over the years as well. Long ago, we used to accept funding requests for all of our budget needs, and in fact, we as staff would actually have to apply to use our own funds. That has changed over the years to where now we have the current policy that is in place, and so that's kind of where we're at right now. Is historically, we haven't really had a set standard as much as it kind of came and went year by year based on what the other demands were for the funding and or how much increment was available. And so we've had some lean years and we've had some other years where we've put considerably more money towards housing.
I would be in favor of one here. I think it aligns with what the Chamber of Commerce and others have talked about housing being a priority for them at this point. Therefore, two, I'm not sure how to look at two as much. I think it's fine going half and half in my opinion. I think we're still flexible in moving funds around as needed as well, if I remember correctly.
For housing, we have more flexibility.
Yeah, but the one thing that does come into play is that our talk about affordable housing from the sales tax increase, we haven't disclosed exactly how that's going to be used or where, and that could have an impact on how we allocate these funds. So we may want to come back to that one in coordination with our discussion about the sales tax increase. My opinion.
Anything further, board members? Okay. Danny, Tammy, do you want to add anything?
I think the only other thing I would add is I think as we formulate this policy, I think it's important to keep in mind the purpose of the RDA, which is basically to work within project areas to build up the tax base and do so in a way that you have those funds available for commercial projects, infrastructure projects, placemaking, and residential. And so our policy there regarding the contribution to the Housing Trust Fund is not necessarily made in jest or just like do we have to continue as much as a reshifting of our priorities as well to where if there are other funds available, what then do you want to prioritize your RDA funds for? And primarily that should be within the project areas to build the tax base, because without that you don't have the tax increment. And so if you're not continuing to grow that base, you're talking about a depreciating amount of money over time rather than putting those funds to something that continues to grow it. So we will continue to bring that up. You'll continue to see that within the policy, but I think that just needs to be kept in mind as we talk about where these funds should be used and how much.
I have a feeling that this is going to be an ongoing education component in your job, so I appreciate that. All right, you don't need any action from us today on this, it looks like. All right.
Just to get input, thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Kate.
All righty, we are moving along to item C4, which is the project area draft plan for State Street, as well as the 9-line project areas. It's been a long time coming on these two bad boys, so can you give us an update?
I will do a quick update as Suze comes up, and then, Mr. Chair, you can decide to what extent of detail you want us to get into. We do not have a PowerPoint presentation prepared for this. Essentially, what you have in your packet is an assemblage of the different pieces you've been seeing over the past few months.
Okay.
And most importantly, what you have, and Board Member Mendenhall is not here, but the major changes that you have, and I wouldn't even say major other than the majority of them are just incorporating Board Member Mendenhall's comments from the last time we came, and then essentially changing that map to reflect what that conversation was. So what you have within these two plans is what we feel is the final draft, incorporating all of those changes and comments, and with the board's consent, this is what we would put out as the proposed plan, and we'd put that out to the community and start gathering input and starting that 30-day clock of community input. And then I would look to Suze and Tammy to add whatever I did not include in that.
Yeah, I think as Danny said, we're looking for just preliminary approval so we can move forward with, as Danny said, the 30-day required public comment period. We would also like to go back out to stakeholders and community councils to make sure that we got it right with their initial input that they provided about a year and a half ago. And we'd also look to finalize the boundary legal descriptions, which are pretty complex. And we're estimating that all of that work would take about a 2-month time period. to complete. And also, just to point out, the two plans are based on kind of maximizing tax increment revenues in the area. So they're based on a 75% collection rate from all of the taxing entities over a 25-year period. So this equates to about $26.5 million for the 9-line over the 25-year period and $59 million for State Street. So as I said, that's maximizing the tax increment. As we negotiate with taxing entities, those amounts could go down, but that's what the plans are based on right now. And we wanted to keep the two plans on a similar track just for efficiencies with taxing entity partners and negotiations.
Yeah.
But State Street's been pretty stable for a while, and Sue's has done some recent changes. So 9-line's been stable, State Street's had some changes.
Yeah,
Give us an update.
Yes, that'd be great. I think the last time I was here to talk about State Street was when we decided to modify the boundary for the project area. So that was done in February, during the February board meeting. And as is shown in the map that's in the project area plan, we have now included the section of the 900 South off-ramp that's now included in the State Street project area. So that's from 3rd West over to Main Street, from 900 South, or between about 10th South and 900 South is what's been added there.
Can
we
you,
also-
Suze, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, it's page 5 of my report, but I don't know how it shows up in your, that's always a tricky one.
Show me the map you're looking at.
Yeah.
Okay.
This one. So it's attachment B.
Yes.
All right.
Got it?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I'm sorry, Suze, will you just walk us through that northern boundary change really quick?
Yep, absolutely. So it adds the area of the 900 South off-ramp. So that is the area from it's along 3rd West on the western edge, between the off-ramp itself and 900 South. And then it goes east as far as Main Street. So we added 3 blocks there.
Great.
Does that work?
That works.
And then we removed, as you'll see in kind of the southern, like the southeast corner, it got kind of a funky shape going on now because we removed the tax exempt property around Salt Lake Community College and Whittier Elementary School. And we also removed the tax exempt properties of the county complex at 2100 South and 2nd East, between State Street and 2nd East. So that was the modification that was done based on the conversation from the February board meeting. And then in addition, there were comments that we received from the December 2017 board meeting, which were, and I'm happy to address any changes to the plan that anyone wants to talk about, but the highlights were mostly the idea that crime wasn't represented clearly enough and that tactics to address crime weren't included. So I wanted to point out that trying to represent the crime was done in the background and opportunities section of the report, and additional tactics were included in Objective 1 of the report. Board Member Mendenhall asked for more description of what the catalytic projects could be for this area, and that information is included in Section 1G, which are specific project area development. That's the heading for it. And so there's a pretty long list there of what those are. Under Objective 4, there was a request to note that this area is a place of immediately affordable housing and that the RDA should be intentional about providing continuity of housing for those individuals as the area is redeveloped. And that statement is also in Objective 4. We have that statement, and we also say that the RDA would plan to create written relocation plans for any properties that the RDA acquires where they're being used as affordable housing at the time of acquisition, similar to the overnighter that we had a written relocation plan. And then finally, the highlight would be the geographic, there were some comments on geographic target areas
first to include the 2 HRCs and also to unite 2 areas that were slightly separate. It was areas 2 and 4 on the previous map. So in section 10I, the HRCs have been included, and areas 2 and 4 were united to become Area 5, which is called General Area Central State Corridor on that map. And I can show you that map or tell you what page it's on in the report. Yeah, that map is, in the report, it's on page 28 of attachment B of the State Street Project Area Plan. And it's the one with all these yellow squares. You can see that.
So that both sorry.
Please.
I feel like I should say that all again.
Both,
Yeah.
both HRCs are included.
Yes, yep. Target Area 1 is for the HRC on 700 South, and Target Area 4 is for the HRC on High/Paramount. I don't know if I totally know which address we're using
That's
today.
all I need to know.
But
Thank you.
Okay,
You gave her the answer she wanted.
okay.
Is there anything else you want to highlight before we open it up to dialogue with board members?
That was all I had in terms of kind of those key changes. But yeah, other than that, just any comments or questions?
A point of clarification really quick. If this board makes changes today, will that preclude you from going out to public comment after today, starting today, essentially?
I don't think so.
No.
Not
Okay.
As long as you gave us concrete changes that you'd want us to incorporate.
Great.
And then have that be part of the plan we move forward with.
Right.
Appreciate that. All right, board members, what do you got? Aaron Mendenhall. Jump on in.
I should add the caveat, unless you change the boundary, then. Okay. If you do
Well,
that, we're starting again.
Now that you mention it, I have a couple ideas.
Just want to take that off the table.
All right, board member Mendenhall.
I'm having a strange thing with my annotation, so I'm just having to scroll through.
I have one I'd like to add maybe really quick. On the 9 line, under changes in land use, I am very interested in adding to, it talks about multifamily and single family. I'm trying to scroll to my location, so I apologize for my delay, but I would like to incorporate some language about adding accessory units.
Page 10.
Yeah, 10. It looks like 10 and 11.
Sure.
You know, we have not yet adopted that policy, but we will here soon. And it's been indicated that this whole project area will be included in the updated policy. So I would like for us to call out accessory dwelling units as a housing type in this in this project area. All right, Mendenhall, go ahead.
Good call. Oh, I'm on page 54 of 117. Thank you, RDA, for listening to my comments in our previous meetings about recognizing human trafficking. And so I have a few little tweaks in there. So on page 1 of the State Street CRA draft plan, if we could change the language of commercial sex to human trafficking, which would then include labor trafficking and sex trafficking, which we note later in the plan are both happening in this district at businesses and on the street.
Could you repeat that one more time? Change it to?
It's commercial sex, the second to the last line of page 1. Change that to human trafficking so that it can include both labor and sex trafficking, both of which are criminal offenses.
Right.
So it fits in that crime category.
And I agree with that. The only thing, my only hiccup is that in this particular sentence, I'm referring to Exhibit A, which lists the crime types, and commercial sex is one of the types that the police department tracks.
But they don't track
So-
labor trafficking.
They don't actually, because they consider that to be like a victim rather than a crime.
Therein lies my problem.
And yeah, so it's hard to get those numbers. I completely agree. But I can,
And, okay, I'll
So-
negotiate with you.
okay,
Put solicitation of commercial sex. I
What's
want that to be the crime that's noted then.
you want to have,
Solicitation of commercial sex.
okay, okay. That makes sense. I think that's what that abbreviation means, so.
Focus on the John.
Okay, perfect.
And then going down through the document, on page 11, I really appreciate the timing, the recognition in your tactics of how critical timing is for these.
Right.
There's some project areas where it's like, let's get the trees in now because they need to grow and it's going to take time, and we're not there yet. And I want to really just point that out to thank you all for participating in the Main Street and Life on State and doing such awesome public outreach for our own project area plan, because this is a sensitive area in a lot of ways. We're not ready for grassy knolls
Right.
on State Street yet. Okay, then on page 13, under Objective 4 for housing, where you were keen to incorporate my requests, the fourth one down, provide resources to support social services. Does social services include housing? Because I guess I maybe ask Andrew that. When people talk about social services, I don't usually think of housing, but is that part of the definition here?
Generally, social service agencies provide support in a housing complex. There are times when they own a housing complex, but depends on how it's licensed, essentially. So generally, housing is housing unless it's like a treatment setting, which is licensed differently. So you have to go to probably the licensing definitions if you want to clarify those two things.
So could RDA increment from this project area be used to support housing specifically for the populations identified in that housing section?
Yes. As long as it's housing.
Okay,
Do you,
guess what? I'm
do you want us
good.
to add housing and social services, or?
I think it's a little vague. That if we could add provide resources to support housing and social services within the area.
Okay.
Great, I'm happy. Thanks.
Totally? Like, that, no. Just with that one bullet. Okay, okay.
Don't pry.
Well, I had a question about the social services, actually. That's all right.
Jump on in.
So, just to clarify, what would be an example of how RDA funds would be used for social service?
Is it capital?
It'd basically be more or less the bricks and mortar for a type of development that could support that type of housing or uses. So we would not necessarily be the operations or the programming as much as the facility itself.
So, say a detox center wants to build in that area. Funds could be used for the bricks and mortar of a social service agency program of some sort, open-ended.
Correct.
But not for services itself, though.
Generally, we would not be a funding source for the services, yeah.
Yeah. That's why I want to clarify about how the funds couldn't be used in there.
There was a recent change to 17C that allows for homelessness assistance, but it doesn't, 17C really doesn't mention social services beyond that.
Yeah.
So that's why, that's why in the plan, we generally use the words like resources, so that it includes everything. And so your comment about housing, as long as it's housing and everything else, you want to make sure you're not limiting yourself, because you could have someone who just wants to build the building and provide the services, and it may not include a housing component. But as long as it's within the project area, you can participate in that.
Yeah, it went back to your previous point about the RDA purposes tax increment increasing and being aware of how much we're investing in things that don't bring any property tax, because social service agencies are generally nonprofit.
Right, but you could have the social service be a tenant in a commercial development that we participate in, and it's taxable.
Okay.
So that's why you want to maintain your flexibility and
Yeah.
have the language not limit you in what you're actually able to use your funds for.
Board Member Mendenhall.
I had one more question under the employment centers objective. That's page 12 or 65 of 117. The very last one is to work with existing major employment centers, and it lists a few. I wonder how we're looking at that, and if ideas or conversations already started in this outreach process, because I'm unaware of those opportunities.
I'm not aware if conversations have already started, but I think it's more or less, if nothing else, you're identifying your potential partners within the project area itself that you'd want to reach out to.
We did, with Salt Lake Community College, they expressed interest in trying to have some sort of partnership about creating more student housing near the school. So that was kind of the main partnership idea that came out of conversations with those potential partners. But we didn't think that was the last conversation we were having with any of these major employment centers. It was just sort of a, when we first got started, so we can keep those conversations going.
Okay.
As the project area.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else, board members? The only thing I'd like to make another reference to is potential for track stop on 17th South.
Yes.
And I don't see that in the report here.
It's, okay, I gotta find it, hang on. Yep, it's in my response to comments document. It's in Objective 5.
Okay.
Which starts on page 13, goes to page 14. And let's see, it's the 4th bullet down. Says that we'll capitalize on rich transit opportunities of existing light rail and bus service to encourage mixed-use residential and commercial transit-oriented development, to maximize access to existing and future public transit, work with Utah Transit Authority and Salt Lake City Transportation Division to understand future transit plans for the area when considering new development and project opportunities, and to support and explore option for a 1700 South track stop with Transportation Division, UTA, SLIC, and others as appropriate.
Perfect.
It's a long bullet as I read it out loud.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Fantastic. Okay, anything else, board members? All right, proceed. 30 days for public comment starting today.
Starting as soon as we make these changes and make the plan available.
Great, good luck.
So, 31 days.
31.
No.
Great, it's about time. Thank you guys very much for accommodating us. All right, board members, we're moving on to item C5, which has been a long time coming as well. This is the Stadler Rail tax increment reimbursement. So we're going to be briefed today by staff members about the Stadler Rail tax increment reimbursement request, which would help pay for infrastructure improvements at the new facility out in the northwest quadrant. So before us today, we have Danny Waltz sticking around, followed by Jill Wilkerson-Smith, which is the project manager with the Redevelopment Agency, as well as Allison Rowland from the City Council office. Thank you all for joining us. Who wants to kick it off?
Would you like to start?
I would like to start because I need to start with a mea culpa. In the reline in the staff report, as well as the motion sheet, there's a typo. So that's a pretty basic problem. It should read, Stadler Rail Community Reinvestment Area, consideration of terms of a participation and tax increment reimbursement agreement.
Not an interlocal.
Cut and paste got out of hand, and it didn't work out, so I apologize for that.
A lot of words in there.
Yeah. I can read that again if you like.
Yes.
Please, that would be great.
Stadler Rail Community Reinvestment Area, consideration of terms of a participation and tax increment reimbursement agreement.
Just taking out interlocal for the distribution of.
Exactly, and adding reimbursement after tax increment. And then maybe just as a review, this will be the third of 3 actions that the board and the council are taking to finalize this process of the tax increment reimbursement agreement through the RDA single property business retention tool. The term sheet included in the transmittal includes language by which Stadler recognizes that any project tax increment is subject to Senate Bill 234, the Utah Inland Port Authority. I have verbal typos as well. So that is in the agreement. It's also in the motion sheet. I understand from Katie Lewis, the attorney, that it could be read or not read when you make the motion.
Great. And just to point out, it looks like we have some guests with us in the audience. We have Martin Ritter, who is the CEO of Stadler. He's visiting us from Switzerland. Hello. As well as Jacob Splain, the project lead here in Salt Lake City. Welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us today. And I will kick it back to Danny and Jill, please.
And I'll kick it to Jill.
Great.
And I've been kicked, so here we go. Before you have the term sheet is split into basically 4 different categories: the payment terms, the permitted uses, the policy requirements that are in our tax increment reimbursement policy, and also the reporting requirements that we are recommending the board consider for approval as part of this term sheet. I can go through these terms in a summary fashion if that would be helpful.
That would be great.
Okay, great. So the payment terms, the maximum tax increment reimbursement over a 20-year term is approximately $9.6 million. The RDA will withhold 5% for administrative costs and 10% for housing, which is required by statute. The permitted uses, as we've discussed previously, are for certain infrastructure improvements that Stadler will build, including site work, public roads and utilities, a test track, and a rail spur. Our policy requirements require that Phase 1 must be completed and a CFO must be issued, and the property must be on the tax rolls as completed before they are eligible for the tax increment reimbursement. The reimbursement must run with the land. That means that the owner that must occupy the property and operate the project in order to receive the tax increment reimbursement. We need notification of any tax appeal in case they decide to protest their taxes that year. And the project must meet the threshold requirements. As you know, we have gone through our finance committee and we have determined that it meets the threshold requirements. For our annual reporting, what we're suggesting the report include is that they report every year the number of full-time employees that they have, which is supposed to increase every phase that they built. They're going to build 4 phases within a 10-year time frame. We require wage information for each job. We also would like some information on the construction status of Phase 1 and the actual costs that are related to the permitted uses subject to receive the reimbursement funds. And that we also get some information on the number of construction jobs. And what we really want to see is just, we want some metric information on how much impact the project will have, not just as a permanent use, but also as it's being built for our own information. We can, the RDA may reduce this tax increment reimbursement if it doesn't meet the requirements that we're asking them to provide it to us annually, or those in our policy. So that's just a review of the term sheet that we've attached for your review and consideration.
All right, board members, the goal, again, of this briefing is to review and consider adopting a resolution that approves this. So before we move in that direction, are there any questions for staff? Anything else you'd like to get addressed before we move along? Nada. Board member Fowler.
It's me. What happens if in one of the phases they don't reach that number, employee number? I mean, considering what if it's 499 and not 500? That seems problematic, but it doesn't seem like,
Right.
I mean, do we just automatically, what happens, Danny?
So the way we propose and the term and the way the agreement would be written is if they don't meet a threshold, the RDA has the option of decreasing the increment. And what that would do is that would then kick it to essentially a conversation with Stadler in terms of why did they not hit the threshold, and or is that a one-time hit? Is that something we should be concerned with? Is it ongoing? And is it of significance to where we should reduce the increment? And likely that reduction in increment would just be a pro rata basis. So that's how it would be structured. It would be at our option so that we can adjust for things if, there's project delays with construction, if the economy tanks, or if they just miss it by 1 or 2. Now, I will tell you that we've had conversations with Stadler. They obviously are concerned for the same reasons that you bring it up, that the way the terms are written right now, it could be interpreted to be a hard line, that if they don't meet, then they get punished. And they have reached out to us and expressed that they would very much like to change that or soften those requirements to protect them from those things. That is not the way the term sheet is written. That is not what we have transmitted to the board. But I think if that is something that the board would be considered to change for them and soften that, they would very much be appreciative of that.
Go ahead,
Not unless you had something.
please.
How would we suggest softening that? I mean, it does seem like pretty hard numbers that seem, if we don't have the workforce, I mean, there's so many variables along that line that
There are, and that's the difficulty in the conversation of, we have expressed those jobs from day one, that's what they have represented, and that's what the reasons are for getting this. What we usually lean to in that instance is the state has a very similar program that they utilize, that Stadler is utilizing also for a sales tax participation from the state, which is totally separate from our deal. But the state has language in there that they essentially just pick a number of 50% of the jobs, and that's their floor. And so that's basically them just stating that that's at the point that they feel that it does merit a reduction, and then anything above and beyond that, we would have the opportunity to adjust if we felt it was warranted. We can obviously go with what the state uses, so there's consistency, or we could do it in such a way that we just soften our language a little bit and create our own little floor that maybe is not that low. And so, and I would be happy to have Martin and Jacob come up and speak to that, but I think that's kind of what we have talked to them about. It is not something we as staff have proposed, because this is what we've transmitted and represented, but it is something that is a concern as we have done the negotiations in the final hour.
One further question on this, sorry, I know you have something, but it's just a quick follow-up. I mean, does the language, and this might be something for Katie, but does the language, even if we had those sort of numbers that are as they are, because I also don't want to delay anything here, right? But, so if the numbers were as they are presented to us today, does the language may give us that leeway that you were talking about, where if there are all of these other variables and Stadler was able to present, like, this is why we didn't hit that goal, this isn't a hard, we reduce or take away this tax increment. Does that protect everyone kind of and give us the leeway?
It gives us the leeway, gives us the ability to have that conversation and make that calculation. It does not give Stadler necessarily the certainty that they would have that throughout the year or throughout the years of the project, so.
Okay.
Board Member Mendenhall.
This is our very first single property CRA.
Yes.
We came up, it's not in our packets today, but there's a process, a timeline, a flow chart, there's reasoning, and there's dialogue with, obviously, with the participant throughout all of this. I don't think, I am comfortable with these numbers. I am comfortable with us having the ability to have a conversation if they aren't fulfilled, and that it isn't necessarily all comfortable for Stadler in this case, or for whomever it might be in the future. I think this is a 90% commitment we're making, contingent upon SB 234, blah, blah, blah. But my goodness, this is a big deal, and this is a long-term commitment we're making, and I feel comfortable with us having very clear thresholds that were worked out with our partner, and will be worked out with every future partner. So I'm uncomfortable with us at the last minute here looking at adjusting these numbers.
Yeah,
there's a good reason we
were not asking
have
for it.
them
There's
here.
a reason why we kept the transmittal as it is.
I
just saying
appreciate that.
in relation to the comment, yes.
Anything further? Board Member Rogers, do you have anything?
Yeah, I just had a clarification on the phases. Are we looking at a total of roughly, for the full-time jobs, is it 976 or is it roughly 2,600?
Oh, 976.
Okay, so it's just tallying as they do each. We're not
Right, this
looking
is
at a total
incremental.
of 2,600. The total jobs for this project is 976.
That's correct, yes.
Great.
Mr.
No
Chair, do you want a
further-
motion?
I'm looking for a motion.
I move that we approve the tax increment reimbursement agreement with Stadler Rail, that the tax increment reimbursement agreement will include the condition that Stadler Rail acknowledges that the RDA's commitment of tax increment for the project is subject to the Utah Inland Port Authority's right to take up to 100% of the tax increment generated within the project area for the purposes set forth in Utah Code 11-58602, enacted by the Utah Legislature as SB 234 in the 2018 legislative session.
It's been moved by Board Member Mendenhall. There's a second by Board Member Fowler. Any discussion? Okay, let's roll call this. We'll start here at District 1. Board Member Rogers, yes. Board Member Fowler?
Yes.
Mendenhall?
Yes.
Wharton?
Yes.
And Johnston?
Yes.
And I'm a yes as well. So that carries unanimously, 6 votes in favor, with Board Member Luke not here today. Congratulations, and thank you to Stadler and their team for working with us and for your patience as we've waded through the complexities that have presented themselves with SB 234. But we appreciate your interest in Salt Lake City and your investment in our community, so thank you for that. That being said, we are going to move right along to item C6, which is an overview of the Redevelopment Agency's budget for fiscal year 2018-2019. And looks like we will be joined once again by Danny Waltz, Jennifer Bruno from the council office. Anybody else?
I'm just changing seats. It has nothing to do with Jennifer.
Well, it looks like we have Ben
Ben
Ludke
is
from
also going to join us.
I wanna be
the
able to
council office.
Also be able to run the PowerPoint, so.
Great.
Sorry. Now I'm surrounded.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is for our fiscal year 19 budget. I have a PowerPoint that I am happy to go through in the interest of time. I'll run through a little bit quicker, some of the background and the mission statements. Reach if that's all right, Mike. Recap, this is what I was referring to earlier in terms of the mission of the RDA, which is to improve areas of the city, targeting that within project areas and carrying out the city's master plan goals. Generally, we like to remind everyone that the RDA is set up by state statute, and as such, there are different provisions and rules that come into play in terms of the RDA's budget and use of funds. Our objectives, I'm happy to share these and come back if there's any questions. Highlight of the project areas, the 2 larger ones on the bottom here are obviously the new ones that we've just discussed, 9 Line and State Street. Here's kind of what we're focusing on, just jumping right into the goals for 2019. First and foremost, our priority is the creation of the 2 project areas we discussed, the implementation and finalization of the Northwest Quadrant project area. We're also focused on the RDA properties that we have being offered and for development. And then the other item we discussed is the NOFA, getting that $10 million out the door in terms of projects and creating development. And then the other thing that you're going to see come up as a theme within this budget is the utilization of our loan programmed funds. We have some allocations to build that up. We're also sitting on a considerable balance of funds that we recognize, but we have quite a bit of requests for those funds right now that we feel are, well, if we total them all up, they're in excess of the funds, and so we either will have priority decisions or we will wait to see how some of those projects come forth. Jumping into the specific funds and just kind of some of the projects and goals that we look forward to in fiscal year 19 within the CBD. Our priorities will be carrying out the agreement for Utah Theater that we have an existing contract with the developer for, and so we will be bringing that to you. Utah Paper Box property disposition, that's under contract, and they're in the final stages of wrapping up their design and working towards getting permitting for that. 255 South State, which is our property offering that just expired a few weeks ago. Just as a quick update, we got 9 responses from developers for that RFQ, so that's extremely encouraging. We're in the process of setting up that selection committee and then reviewing those. And then carryover from last year, which is the downtown placemaking. This is the capital project within CBD that is in our budget. Essentially looking to either leverage with a private development or promote some kind of open space and pedestrian scale improvement downtown. Here are the key changes within Central Business District. First and foremost is the decrease in tax increment revenue. That is a decrease of over $5 million from last year. This is something that we actually took the hit this year as part of our assessment and our distribution of increment. We are in the process of working both with the county assessor and the state tax commission to try to figure out why that happened to the level it did. And then we as the RDA are also going to engage a consultant to help us address that as it relates to not only Salt Lake City, but redevelopment agencies countywide. Number 2 key change that you see within your budget, well, number 2 and number 3 is essentially a $2 million and $1 million allocation for commercial and residential loans within the Central Business District. These are funds that would be utilized through the agency's existing loan program for commercial and residential development within the Central Business District. And then the $344,000 is the capital project that I referred to that would be utilized for placemaking and open space within CBD. And please, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, so if you have any questions, please just jump in and stop me, or any concerns. Jumping to West Capitol Hill, this is a project area that has technically expired. However, we have extended it for an additional number of years to collect money to finish the 300 West 300 West street improvements. But what you have here is within the project area, we still have quite a few projects that are wrapping up, and this is the close on the sale properties for the mixed-use project with 252 units, the Marmalade Park within that project, the renovation of the home on Arctic Court that we have, the construction of an infill home on the lot next to it on Arctic Court. We have the 300 West Streetscape project that I mentioned. That is the only project that is getting funding this year as a capital project. And then we have the townhome project that is nearing completion of the 12 townhomes right there on 500 North. So our key changes within this is just taking all of the increment that's available, 400,000. We feel that this is hopefully going to be enough now to do this project, and so we will wrap up the design and hopefully work towards starting construction this year. Within West Temple Gateway, excuse me, this is the last year that we collect increment from West Temple Gateway. A couple of the projects we're wrapping up is the 900 South Streetscape and utility undergrounding. That is one that we are still waiting on the final cost from Rocky Mountain Power, and then we plan to bring to the board in terms of the design and the level of construction that we want to do the streetscape improvements. The property disposition for Infinite Scale, as well as the property disposition for Spy Hop, those are nearing negotiations and completion, and we should be closing on those properties soon. Jefferson Walkway project is essentially done from our standpoint. Our loan has been paid off, and if they haven't sold all of the units, I think they have almost all of them under contract right now, and so that one is wrapping up. West Montrose property is a property assemblage that we have in the area that we are going to continue to explore the opportunities for redevelopment and put that out hopefully within the next year or so for an opportunity. And then the row house project that is nearing completion of construction of those townhomes. Key changes for West Temple Gateway, and this is something I need to highlight as something that is incorrect in your budget. Under your West Temple Gateway fund, it shows it is listed as a CIP 900 South street improvements. That is incorrect. That line item should read 650 South Main Light Rail Station. And so this is an allocation of the $558,000 that we would like to contribute towards the construction of a light rail station there on Main Street and 650 South. Moving on to Depot, the projects that we have that we look to wrap up in fiscal year 19 is the Station Center. This is both in terms of finalizing the negotiation for the individual agency parcels that we have under contract right now. You'll recall that as a board, you authorized the ability to write down the land to build some of the related infrastructure. And then we also have the overall infrastructure of 300 South and Woodbine Court that we are wrapping up the design on right now and hope to come back to the board with a discussion on the costs as well as the funding possibilities for that. We have the public market that we have wrapped up that plan. As you understand, the Downtown Alliance has indicated an interest to continue to pursue that project. Conversation with the board Also indicated that you directed us to continue to work with the state on the Fair Park type of feasibility study. You will see that as part of the North Temple project as we get to that. We are under the process of looking at redesigning the 500 West Park blocks, and that is going through the stakeholder committee meeting, and we are looking at alternatives, so that's something we hope to bring back this year. And then the Central Station Area Plan, this is working with the grant we received from Wasatch Front Regional Council to look at not only some of the agency's remaining parcels in the area, but also UTAs and some of the other vacant land in terms of trying to come up with the plan of how best those could be utilized and marketed for development. Key changes within Depot, essentially what we have available in terms of tax increment is just $400,000. We have set that aside as a capital project for both the station center infrastructure conversation, as well as we identify alternatives for 500 West, it could be made available to make those changes happen as well. And so it's something that, as we wrap up those two projects, we wanted to set aside the funds and have them available to finish those two projects. Granary District, projects and goals. We just closed or approved the latest adaptive reuse loan program for Orchid Dynasty to renovate a 5,500 square foot building for their location in the area. We are finalizing the negotiations with the Bicycle Collective for our Gale Street property. We continue to work with Hand in terms of the RFP and selection of consultant for the fleet block development. And then we have funds available at this point with 400 West reconstruction project that we've talked about in terms of how to utilize those. Key changes for Granary, $214,000 towards the adaptive reuse loan program. This is a combination of the remaining funds within that program as well as a new allocation. North Temple project area, overnighter motel property is on the market right now with RFPs due at the end of the month. We continue to work with public utilities and transportation to push forward the Folsom Corridor project, as well as finish the pedestrian improvement project as part of the I-15 and North Temple Viaduct Bridge construction. And then Board Member Rogers just stepped out, but we have obviously the State Fair Park Public Market Study funds that we are utilizing. We are wrapping up the scope of that work with the state right now so that we can put out an RFP to get a consultant to move that study forward. Key changes for North Temple, very small amount of $95,000. We identified to just put as a commercial development loan program availability.
Just to confirm, the scope of the Fair Park study is exclusively to explore feasibility of a market?
Yes, and what the state has asked is that it's a public market component as part of their White Ballpark development opportunity.
White Ballpark, what is that?
That is the property just south of the Fair Park. It's the large parking lot that serves the Fair Park across from North Temple.
Okay.
That is a piece that they are in discussions with developers right now to see what the opportunities are for redevelopment. And they have asked that we utilize that property as well as potentially the whole Fair Park, depending on what the consultant comes back with.
Cindy Gus Jensen.
Just, that's new information in terms of White Ballpark. That's been a parcel that has been on people's development thought board for 25 years. So I thought that when the council board appropriated the funding, it was utilizing existing infrastructure at the Fair Park. I think it creates a whole other conversation if it's about constructing something new across the street on a parcel that's pretty tough.
Yeah, and I apologize. I didn't mean to give the impression it was either or. The state has just asked that that could also be included as part of the study to see if that's a potential. It's a scope that they are working with us on. It's a scope that would need to come back to the board in terms of whether that's the direction we wanted to utilize the funds. So we're not seeing it as just that and not the Fair Park as much as it's all of their
Mr.
property there
Chair?
that they see as opportunities.
I recall us, I'm sorry, Board Member Mendenhall, but maybe we need to dig back into the minutes a bit, but I thought we walked back this idea a little bit to expand the scope of the study to be broader than just the market, the public market. Am I up in the night here?
You might not be.
Okay.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, it seems a little bit limiting to me to just look at the Fair Park as well as the parcel across the street exclusively in context of a public
and we
market.
as staff went to the state and said, we have these funds available. This is the conversation that we've had with the board. We've asked them to come back to us with how they would want to utilize that for the development of the Fair Park in their property, and then see where we can align those goals and make that study beneficial to them, and also hopefully address the concerns and objectives of what we want to accomplish.
Okay, I have
We'll go back to the minutes per your recommendation, but I think what I remember from it is that the council didn't want to exclude a public market as an activator for the space, but to your point, wanted to broaden the idea of activation at the market, or sorry, at the Fair Park.
See, we're calling it a public market study, so that feels pretty narrow in scope.
Right, and
so.
I think it was changing the scope without changing the title, which is something we just didn't do.
Okay, we have a comment or a question from Board Member Mendenhall, then Board Member Fowler. Okay.
If the state is wanting to broaden, if we find from our minutes that it didn't include necessarily the property across the street, then I would look to them to make a financial contribution to that study.
Okay, we can certainly pass that along as well.
Anything else? Okay. Carry
Yeah.
along.
Oh.
Board Member Johnston, please.
Yeah, just, I know from the last meeting, I do recall broadening it. I want to make sure, though, that it doesn't mean we exclude it. So not trying to avoid discussion of the market by saying we're going to broaden it to development, but make sure it's a part of it.
I think that's what Jennifer Bruno mentioned.
piece.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
But we'll confirm that.
Thank you. All right,
Excellent.
Danny.
So as I said, North Temple, just allocating the $95,000 to be available for commercial loans. Block 70, this is one that essentially is just a collection of increment for the debt service on Eccles Theater, but two of the projects we are still wrapping up as part of Eccles and the block is number one, the public art, and the request for proposal being finalized in terms of selection of an artist, and we anticipate that being announced soon. And then the Regent Street Hotel property that the agency owns, and we're continuing to work with the developers and wrapping up the negotiations of that and seeing how that project is going to proceed. And then just quickly going through some of the key changes of some of our other funds. Within the program income fund, I think it was within the staff report, there was a question on the marketing and sales. The difference in the amount for this is a consolidation of the marketing accounts that we had in several other project area funds, which it didn't necessarily seem the right way to do that in terms of separating our marketing budget by project area as much as just consolidating it as for an overall agency use and allocation. Our professional services account went up to $350,000. This is an increase in funds primarily for an obligation we have as part of the Utah Theater agreement with the developer, that to the extent that we do not choose to move forward with that developer for their proposed project, we have a provision that we need to reimburse them up to $100,000 for their services that they've provided. And then ultimately, we would own that data and information that we could then use, but it was one of those provisions in the agreement that to the extent they do work and they don't move forward with the project, we would reimburse them for it and then take ownership of that.
And Mr. Chair, if I could just note that this is probably one of the last holdovers of the contracts as they were written sort of under the previous model of including a dollar amount in a contract without the budget for the contract. So you guys hadn't budgeted this previously, and it's just hanging out there as a contractual obligation.
Thank you.
And then number three is allocation of over $800,000 again to be available for commercial loans within the RDA's loan program. Citywide housing, this ties into the housing funding policy discussion we had earlier. This is taking our 10% of housing, using it citywide, essentially splitting it 50-50 between use by the agency within the residential loan program guidelines, and then as an allocation to the Housing Trust Fund. That's it.
Okay, board members, let's open this up to general policy questions.
Well, Mr. Chair, I don't know if we, do we have to get through all the policy questions today?
We don't have to.
And I have a lot of questions, so I actually want to ask if we could set up a one-on-one, or if anyone else wants to do a small group meeting, so I don't have to take 30 minutes to go through my questions and concerns.
Maybe worthwhile for us to set up a small group meeting with staff for RDA and maybe economic development as well. I mean, for budget purposes, as we wade through this massive city budget that we've got in front of us.
I think these are all good policy questions, and
Yeah.
I hope that we can have time in our upcoming meetings to pick through them.
Well, the budget's going to fly by, as you know, so I think it would be worthwhile for us to carve out a little bit of time for board members to sit down with RDA staff and city council staff to dive into some of these questions a little bit more. And I know that there will be projects and ideas that certain board members would like to either include or exclude from the budget. So I think that may be worthwhile, but we've got them in front of us today. Is there anything that is pressing that needs to come out right now, or do you want to? Okay.
And to your point, Mr. Chair, I think we've discussed in the past to schedule additional RDA board meetings throughout May as needed. So maybe we can set up a small group meeting and hone in on some of the questions that might benefit from a full board conversation, and then work with the chair to figure out council time that makes sense to carve out.
Yes, we did. Danny, Amy, or Board Member Fowler here was just asking about the 2 loan programs in the staff report, and we spoke about this yesterday in our small group meeting, but if you could just clarify what those 2 programs are and are not.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the agency has its existing loan program, which is an adopted program and policy by the board, which essentially drives any loan that we do and provides the approval of those loans, as well as at what thresholds it would come back to the board. So what we've done within the budget here is simply allocate funds accordingly to be used within that loan program for either commercial or residential uses.
And I did want to flag for the board, just linking a conversation, straw poll, not sure if you actually straw polled it or just signaled intent, of allocating funds from CBD to the Housing Trust Fund, sort of CBD to citywide housing and then to the Housing Trust Fund. Currently, the only funding that is in the CBD that's proposed to go for housing is for that residential development loan program, which is not for the Housing Trust Fund necessarily. So if you wanted to make that adjustment, you'd have to make that change to the mayor's recommended budget. And then with that caveat, the CBD has significantly less increment this year than it did last year, and so that is also part of the balance and challenge of this year's budget.
Great. So Board Member Rogers, who's not here right now, earlier mentioned bonding for housing, and I see this as number 1 on the policy question. So if, as we set up these small group meetings, if staff could come prepared to discuss bonding for housing, but as well as the catalytic projects for the 2 new project areas that we are about to create in the 9 Line and State Street, just to have for you folks to be prepared to discuss that. I also would appreciate it if staff could dig out some of the recommendations from our consultants that we retained a few years back for the parking study, find out what action items might exist in that report. Board Member Mendenhall.
I'll add one thing to come back, hopefully, with some information around the item 6 in our staff report, the residential development loan program at 1.4 million. I want to know how this ties into our affordable housing priorities, and if it doesn't, then I would like to revisit our conversation that we just had around 80% AMI and below, and have a conversation with the board around lowering that to 60% or lower if we're putting $1.4 million here, and with the state's option that there be no AMI requirements in areas of blight. I think that opens up the space for equity in that way, but that if we're putting a lot of money towards residential loans that aren't tied to affordability, I think we need to have that in context with our affordable funding conversation.
Great point. Board Member Fowler.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Board Member Mendenhall, because I'm looking at both 5 and 6, the commercial development loan program and the residential development loan program. And as we sort of discussed yesterday, but, I think that we need to, and we discussed earlier today, have some policy discussion around what is the goal of RDA versus what is the goal of HAND or other sort of housing. Well, I'm going to say HAND because that's pretty much the only other one. That what are those different goals, and objectives, and how can we make sure these organizations are moving parallel together while not competing or kind of reinventing the wheel. And so I think that, and I would maybe charge the rest of us to really think about what is our goal for RDA, what is our priority as we are developing and looking at developing, and what are those objectives. And I think that kind of just ties into some of those ongoing questions and concerns that we've mentioned yesterday and today, and not concerns, but discussions that need to be had as to, so that we're prioritizing RDA in hand and what we want out of both of them, right? The only other thing that I was thinking about after we met yesterday was, and I don't know why this is my new big kick, but I wrote this note regarding the loan programs that says, how are we going to track parameters and which parameters to ensure that the programs are successful? So similar to sort of our monitoring that we went through in discussions with the NOFA, I'm interested in creating or determining, again, I think this is our job, some parameters as to which we need to be monitoring so that we are ensuring that we're meeting those objectives that we have for RDA and for this money, right? I think I think that data will be very important as we continue to go forward in funding these things and making sure that we're hitting all of those marks that we want to hit.
Thank you, Board Member Fowler. Anything else before we move forward? Board Member Mendenhall.
I guess I'm being asked to share my questions now, not for discussion necessarily, but so that when we have our small group meeting, it might be able to be more productive. So I'll just quickly mention that I would like to look at where we can memorialize in policy item B under, so I'm on page 3, it's numbered page 3, and it's page 3 of 11, B around the board asking or making that policy, having a policy discussion around whether or not all project areas contribute to the administrative budget on the basis of what they can afford. Basically, do you get only what you generate
Board Member
proportionally or not?
I think what you're bringing up are all really great points. I think it may be worthwhile for you to map them out in writing and send them to staff before we have our group meeting. I don't know that it's necessarily important for us to go line by line right now, unless, of course, you'd like to.
I must have misunderstood the request.
Or I sent a poorly written request. We were just hoping to get some notes from you. Sorry about that. Thank you, I'm sorry.
And that goes for all board members as well. As you look through this, if you have questions, send them to staff so that when we do have our small group meetings, they can come prepared and we can be as productive as possible. All right, I'd like to move us along just because we've got a long agenda ahead of us with the City Council. Staff, Danny, anything else you'd like to bring up with regard to the budget before we move along?
Just to your point, a question you brought up yesterday regarding project area seed funds. Within our program income fund, there is $200,000 line item for project area creation. We have traditionally used that for both the process of creating a project area as well as having that potentially available as seed funds. So that'd be the first comment. The second comment would be one of the advantages of using the RDA loan program is that as soon as a project area is created, you can do loans within a project area at any time. And so if we build up the funds associated with the loan program, then that would be available from day one to start doing projects within those new project areas. So
great.
Two things to keep in mind, but following up on our conversation yesterday.
Appreciate that. Jennifer, Bruno, Ben, anything?
I think sending us your questions is the key message that we'd love to get them. So
great.
Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, we will move on to item C7, report and announcement from the executive director. I don't see Mayor here, but David, do you have anything to offer? Nothing. Staff, do you have anything to offer that's not on the agenda?
I do, just real quick, a few things. We talked about the RFQ, bless you, for State Street. We also talked about the RDA Finance Committee approving adaptive reuse loan for the Orchid Dynasty. Clearwater Homes, the Marmalade Block in West Capitol Hill, they have gone through and received their certificate of appropriateness from the planning department, so that's the last step they need for them to be able to pull a permit, and they're still hoping at breaking ground this summer. And then you had indicated Rose Center, our fellowship program. I was in Detroit last week for that. We are about at the midpoint for this process, of which the Salt Lake City is one of the fellowship cities within this program, to take a look at one of our land use challenges. Some of you may have participated in those stakeholder meetings when the group was here a couple weeks ago. If you remember, as part of the final presentation, we were given homework to start carrying out and move that forward. So our meeting last week in Detroit was to essentially follow up on that homework and start giving a status report on where we're at. So we have done that. And then we also look to have a follow-up meeting this summer in anticipation of kind of wrapping up the final pieces as part of what will be the presentation in November at the end of it. So it was a great program. It was a great time in Detroit, having an all-day session of wrapping up with all the cities and updating them on what we've been working on.
In 2 minutes or less, what are your key takeaways?
Our key takeaways are that we need to build a better relationship with the University of Utah as one of the major employment centers and stakeholders within the city. And I'm happy to report we've already reached out and had 3 meetings with the university on several different levels that I think are going to be very fruitful for the long-term benefit of Salt Lake City. And that we need to look at that area in terms of not only a zoning change, but also aligning policies and programs that can interact with that zoning change and see development happen. And that University of Utah's designation and powder program for their living laboratory of a high-tech, looking at infrastructure for wireless network as a laboratory for people to come and experiment of how the future of that could evolve, I think is going to be critical not only for that area, but an attraction for Salt Lake City as a whole.
Great.
So, how's that? And then one final piece, I'm happy to report and announce the hiring of Corinne Piazza as our project coordinator. Corinne comes to us from NeighborWorks. She has a background in community and development branding and marketing. She also has her master's in land use and planning and real estate development. And so she is eager in taking on probably more projects than she realizes that staff is willing to give her right now. But we're happy to have her.
All right, can we break the ice really quick and get her on the mic?
Sure, I warned her you may do that. I tried to protect her, but...
Thank you. And just... if you have anything to offer, please, introduce yourself, talk about, you've been here for 3 weeks, right?
Yes, this is week 3.
Great. And what are you working on and what are you most excited about in joining the RDA?
Well, they were teasing me because I already have so many projects they felt nobody else had anything to do. So I'm diving in and I'm shadowing a lot of folks and working on everything from the Granary Mural Project to helping with RFQs for State Street. So it's been excellent just jumping in with the team and seeing what I can contribute and also everything I need to learn.
Great. Well, welcome aboard. Any questions?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good luck. All right, report and announcement from the chair and vice chair. I don't have anything really, but do you have anything to, Vice Chair Fowler?
Not that I can
No.
think of. Mr. Chair, could I
yes.
ask a question
Yes,
of
please.
staff? Because there's not really that kind of a feedback opportunity in the agenda, but I guess more of a statement that we'd asked for a State Street-esque experience somewhere in the country, and we really didn't get that in Minneapolis, really in any way, shape, or form. And I understand that that's really an administrative task that we're asking the administration to take on to find us something that we could learn from hands-on. And it doesn't, I'm wondering how we can expand the conversation so that we can actually come to a learning opportunity. And perhaps, and you mentioned Detroit, which reminded me that I wanted to say, so it's in the minutes, I don't feel like we've fulfilled this request to learn from a city that's redeveloped an area similar to State Street with similar challenges as we have there. And so I just want to kick it back out there and see if we can
We would
come
be
up with
happy to follow
something.
back up and go back out to the list we've done and see if there's one of those that maybe we want to go and tour and visit. Because I would agree that the streets we looked at in Minneapolis, while they were very interesting and very successful in the challenge that they sought out to accomplish, they were not necessarily directly relevant to what we have on State Street. So if you'd like, we'd be happy to continue that conversation and look at some of the other streets and follow up with you.
I'd appreciate that.
And I will say, for what it's worth, we did not go to Minneapolis for this purpose in particular. We were hoping to achieve an efficiency here by adding it onto the Downtown Alliance Urban Exploration. If you recall, there was that staff report from RDA staff on a couple State Street-esque places around the country. One of them was Colfax in Denver, for instance. We have the budget coming up. We might consider setting some RDA funds aside for staff exploration if you'd like, and we can have that dialogue as we go along, because I think that there are some things to be learned from other communities about State Street. So thank you for bringing that up, Board Member Mendenhall. Item D is written briefings. Any questions on the written briefing, the budget amendment, final budget amendment for this year? Okay. Now we are at the consent agenda, which is to confirm the dates for the FY 2019 RDA budget. And I think it'd be important to note that this year's RDA budget is a lot cleaner and nicer and incorporated in the overall city budget, which I think makes it a little bit more, quite a bit more transparent for the general public and a lot easier for staff. So thank you to RDA and the administration for bringing it to us like this year. Thank you very much. I know that a lot of work over the last 18 months or so went into realigning the RDA, and I think that we have landed in a really productive spot, so thank you very much. It looks like the dates that we are going to be confirming today are Tuesday, May 15th next week, as well as Tuesday, June 5th at 7 p.m. to accept public comment for the RDA budget. Do I need a motion on this? No? I don't know.
Consent agenda, yeah.
Okay, okay, so I will look for an approval.
I move to approve the consent agenda.
It's been moved by Board Member Board Member Fowler.
Second.
And a second by Board Member Johnston. All in favor?
Aye.
That motion carries, so those dates are set. Fantastic. All right, and finally, today I would like to move us into a closed session for the purposes of strategy to discuss pending or reasonably imminent litigation. So if you are not...
Do we need a second and
Yes, I
roll
guess.
call that?
Yeah, excuse me. So I'll make that motion.
Yeah.
And I have a second by Board Member Mendenhall. All in favor?
Aye.
That motion carries. All right, if you are allowed to be in here, please stick around. If not, we will gently excuse you from our meeting.
And let's say the council meeting will try to convene at 1:45.
All right, and we will make this a very quick closed session. The council meeting will convene at 4:45.
45 minutes late.